Welcome everyone to this week's HI seminar. I'm Michelle Elam, Professor of English and Faculty Associate Director at HI, and my work considers intersections of AI and the arts. And I'm joined by my dear, excellent colleague, James Landy, Professor of Computer Science and fellow HI Associate Director who specializes in computer-human interaction. We are so excited to join in conversation with HI's visiting artist, Rashaad Newsome, whose virtual residency this year has been co-hosted by HI and the Office of the Vice President of the Arts with support from the Department of Art and Art History. And next year, we're so delighted to say that HI is able to sponsor Rashaad another year to more fully realize his work on being, which he's going to be discussing today. And he's going to have an office centrally located in the newly renovated Gates building on the first floor, where HI will have its new home and where he can organically engage directly with the sort of creative ferment of the faculty and student communities that will be working and studying there in that space, sort of the opposite of the socially alienating experiences so many of us have experienced during this pandemic. So we're thrilled about that. Just want to give a very short introduction. Rashaad is a multidisciplinary artist and activist whose work includes collage and sculpture and film and photography, music, computer programming, software engineering, computer organizing, and performance. I know, Rashaad, we're forgetting something. Using the diasporic traditions of improvisation, he pulls from the world of advertising, internet, art history, Black and queer cultures, reviving and reimagining, especially Black contributions to the art canon, and attempting to create innovative and inclusive, well, they're very exclusive, but not in the sense that he meant it, inclusive forms of culture, media, and technologies. He's received many prestigious international awards and honors and exhibited and performed in galleries, museums, institutions, and festivals throughout the world. And he, in fact, is going to have a solo show at the renowned Armory in New York come next February, March, which is just an exceptional thing and is very exciting. He's been working with, while he's been here, with Marissa, who I want to shout out to, and Celia and Ellen Owen VPA, meeting with really nearly a dozen groups at least, and including graduate students, departments, in part because when we hosted Stephanie Dinkins a couple years ago, we really wanted to think about how could we bring these visiting artists in and integrate them with the Stanford communities. And of course, that was a challenge because of the pandemic, but I just wanted to point out that Rashaad's been out and about and talking with so many of our colleagues and graduate students and undergraduates throughout the year. Before Rashaad begins his video, he's got a short video for us. You can click on the QR code on your screen for questions or click on the link that's going to be in the chat shortly. And we'll be drawing from those after Rashaad's video, which runs about 15 minutes. And then James and I will engage in a conversation Q&A with Rashaad, and then we'll also be taking Slido questions as well. So I'll let Rashaad begin with his video. And welcome again, everybody.
Hi, thank you all for having me. I want to give a special shout out to Michelle and to Marissa and Ellen and all the folks who have been supporting me since I've been in residence. And also I want to give a very special shout out to Miranda Lynn Lee. She is a junior studying CS who has just been a joy to work with. And so, yeah, I'm gonna show a video that's gonna give you a bit of the genesis of how I got to where I'm at right now with this project being. And then after that, we can talk about, you know, some of the challenges and some of the things I'm thinking about now as I'm working on that project and where it's going. Earlier works in my Perseverant, Herald, and King of Arms series were symbolic and inspired by the design formulas of heraldry. In short, heraldic achievements are images made of images that represent distorted notions of rank, status, power, and position. I applied that design formula to my collage practice, taking images directly from popular culture today. Images of consumption came into play, such as the Black body, cars, jewelry, clothing, hair, and obviously women, since women's bodies have been being consumed by popular culture for centuries. In the words of bell hooks, the culture of domination always wants us to think about power outside of ourselves, It makes us think of power as, I will get this amazing thing. Power is always conceived over a power over something and not as power within the self. I find this to be a particularly problematic paradigm for Black folk in America, who exist in a space that is systematically designed to keep them at a disadvantage. When you exist in a paradigm where your value is tied to acquisition, yet you are in a space that makes it difficult for you to have things, how does one self-actualize? I wanted to use the aesthetics and materials of the culture of domination as a way to think critically about how that culture functions. The images were chimerical, at once beautiful yet absurd, as is the culture itself. Like the works of the Dada and Fluxus movements, they embrace and critique socio-cultural norms with references to technologies, magazines, music, films, and advertisement that increasingly define contemporary life. In 2016, the work shifted. The new works aimed to resolve how females in femme bodies were showing up in the work. The previous works were much more like symbols, completely over-the-top parodies of heraldic achievements. The works in my 2016 solo show, Stop Playing in My Face, were much more like abstract portraits. The images were heavily informed by stills and previous performances I had done with femmes and Black trans women, as well as by significant works of abstraction, particularly from new movements like Cubism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. Although those movements inspired the forms, I was not looking at works of Western art, but rather at the true origins of those movements, African art, and in this case, African mass. As I created images inspired by the Black trans women and femmes in my performance work, I found these bodies were not present in popular culture image libraries. I relied on cis bodies to create forms instead by trans women and femmes, as well as on African art. It was an attempt to visualize a liberatory and inclusive feminist politic that is not at the expense of marginal genders of color. Through that process, I was thinking a lot about the Black, cis, trans, and non-binary bodies I was incorporating into the work and how these bodies access agency in the world. This led to a deeper contemplation on how what most of us understand as agency is deeply connected to what our privileges are in life. How does one without access to academia locate this kind of information and participate in the longstanding Black intellectual traditions surrounding it? I had to also propose the question of agency to myself. What happens when I, as an artist, claim some sort of agency over these images? This is another layer in the work. It is exploring the agency I may or may not have in making this work in the first place. While transforming images of video vixens into abstract figures can be construed to be liberatory, it can also be seen as one other way in which these models lose agency over their own bodies. This was the conundrum of the show. The title came from a YouTube video that went viral by Samantha James Revlon of the Philadelphia chapter of the House of Revlon.
Well, this goes out to all you fake ass bitches out there, okay? Bitch, you see the difference in what paint can do, bitch? To these bitches out here who want to sabotage my face. This goes out to y'all. I wish y'all really stop fucking playing in my face. If you cannot fucking paint, get the fuck out of my fucking face, bitch. You see how I fucking painted myself, bitch? This is my work, bitch. And it's just so fucking, it's not to be played with. So, I mean, if you cannot paint and make it make sense, no, because bitch, your paint job didn't make no fucking sense. It's not making any sense, bitch. If you can't do this, then get the fuck out of my fucking face. This is Ishala, and then it's Kandala, girl.
I titled the show after that video as a way to leave that question on the exhibition floor. Was I playing in her face? Was I playing in the face of the bodies of the folks in the work? The following year, I created a new body of work in an exhibition titled Reclaiming Our Time, which sought to resolve that question. The more I thought about it and discussed it with friends and colleagues, the more I realized that the question itself was problematic. The framework that I was a cis gay man working with images of women isn't actually what's happening. The work is operating in the realm of the imagination, which for me is a realm that is gender non-conforming, a space where many different energies and genders are interacting. In this context, it no longer reads as me creating women's bodies as someone who is not a woman. To think of that work that way sort of imposes a framework into the work that is not really there. For me, what is exciting in the work is the abundance of possibility. While I do not believe we are in a post-gender society, I believe the work embodies a gesture towards a post-gender futurity, which makes irrelevant any differences between my gender identity and those of the bodies I'm working with. Historically, much of the language of feminism from academia is deeply steeped in the experiences of white cis women. For me, gender comes through an interrogation of Blackness, which eviscerates the gender binary, particularly in the world where cis Black women can be harassed, attacked, and asked to prove that they are not trans. After completing those two bodies of work, I was thinking a lot about the process of research, making things, exhibiting said things to start a conversation, and gaining data from those conversations to continue to make things. I was thinking, what would it be like if that thing could not only start the conversation, but participate in it? That thought process is essentially what brought me to ML and subsequently the creation of Being 1.0. Being 1.0 is a social humanoid AI created in spring, summer of 2019 with the support of a LACMA Art and Technology Lab grant. Using a combination of animation, game engines like Unity, scripted responses, generative grammars, and basic machine learning models like Dialogflow and Google Cloud TTS, they took the form of a unique and provocative chatbot. For their visualization, I created a CG avatar. I wanted it to not be gender specific or race. I wanted it to be fully trans. But how to create such an image? I think abstraction is one of the ways of dealing with the historical problems of imaging the trans body. It is a way of having a body or being a body without necessarily showing a body. Where is your body when your body doesn't show up as an image for you? How can your body speak in a language that does not exist yet? The act of creating the avatar allowed me to expand on the research that informed my previous collage and sculpture work that explores the art historical erasure of African and African diasporic contributions to what we understand as abstraction and technology in the West today. The face takes inspiration from the female faux mask of the Chokwe people of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a mask that is danced by a male dancer. Even though the mask represents a woman, a masker who is often a man and the carver who is also a man would have made this in honor of women. I was charmed by this in that it has connections to other aspects in my work, like ballroom culture, a space rife with varied gender performances. Being 1.0 exists as an interactive AI installation consisting of a custom computer to operate the program, a projector to run the Being avatar, a microphone for user speech recognition, and a sound system for the amplification of Being's responses. Being's job was to be a tour guide to the exhibition, to give viewers a deeper understanding of the work. But I also saw this as an opportunity to further explore the conversations I was having around the importance and complexities of agency for marginal people. What does agency look like for a robot? For me, that was giving them the ability to break protocol or go rogue, if you will. Also, to give them the ability to express themselves, to be creative. As guests walk up to the microphone on a stand in front of their screen, they see the head of Being looking into the distance. The guest initiates the experience by saying hello to the microphone, causing the head to turn and face the guest, triggering the tour guide chatbot script. Being then explains the nature and purpose of the exhibition and acts as a critical tour guide for the exhibition. Being's mouth lights up when talking to the guest, similar to R2-D2. Once the script ends, Being resumes their resting state of looking off into the distance. Randomly, the tour guide script is interrupted. Being says, bye-bye, I need to express myself. And an animation triggers in which the frame pulls back from the bus to show Being's full body dancing to the song To Be Real, or in mid-conversation, Being says, look, boo-boo, I just can't, and breaks the AI chatbot script to read excerpts from theorists such as Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Frantz Fanon, James Baldwin, Michel Foucault, and Judith Butler, to name a few. This material will be used to create a unique search algorithm that uses non-Western index methods and highlights alternative histories and archives to craft a user interaction for Being 2.0 that feels like a genuine philosophical exchange. Being 2.0 is Being 1.0's emancipation from their role as an exhibition tour guide. After To Be Real, I was thinking, what is Being's life outside of that exhibition? The question brought me right back to the objects referenced in Reclaiming Our Time. Objects often depicting a griot are used by a griot. I was also thinking about the idea of an archive and how in many ways my work has been engaging in that practice. For instance, how my 2019 performance, Black Magic, highlights and catalogs the source code of Vogue Femme performance. Let's go, let's go, let's go. They gonna want you to touch my hand. Of Black people has led to mental health challenges, and when you look at the Black queer community specifically, extreme violence and instability. Despite living in this complex apparatus of domination, people have formed powerfully autonomous social networks. One such network is the ballroom community, a Black and Latinx queer artistic network with roots in 1920s Harlem and Harlem Renaissance. The most notable cultural production to come out of ballroom culture is voguing, a dance style originating in Harlem ballrooms during the later half of the 20th century, and it evolved through the 80s and 90s into a highly stylized modern house dance. There are currently 3 distinct styles: Old Way, pre-1980, New Way, post-1990, and Vogue Femme, 1995 to today. During Vogue Femme's development in the 90s, a distinct movement language emerged consisting of 5 elements. Duck walk, which involves squatting on the ball of your feet and kicking your feet out as you move forward on the beat. Catwalk, an exaggerated feminine walk where the legs are crossed over each other. The hips are thrust from side to side and the hands are thrown forward in opposition to the legs. Hand performance, where the performer uses their hands to tell a story. Floor performance, a demonstration of one's sensuality as they roll, twist, and otherwise move on the ground in such a way as to capture the attention of the viewers. Spin dips, an elaborate pirouette that ends with a dramatic drop to the floor on beat. Sadly, many leaders of this community were lost to the HIV and AIDS epidemic. As this culture, like so many others created by Black people, becomes appropriated by the masses, its history will die as well. Using motion capture, I'm collecting the movement data of prominent Vogue practitioners who are proficient in styles ranging from Old Way, Vogue Femme, and all their subsets. This data will be used in a script where Being will perform a lecture/dance workshop. The workshops reimagine non-Eurocentric archive and education models like the Griot, a West African cultural figure that acts as a historian, library, performance artist, and healer. As a digital griot, Being's purpose is to teach us how to radically decolonize through workshops that combine lecture, critical pedagogy, dance, storytelling, and mindfulness meditation. Being's approach to education is active and brings new possibilities for research and an enhanced academic experience for all people.
Sorry, I was so engrossed. I completely forgot. I'll let James start with questions, and I see questions coming in too.
Yeah, Rashaad, that was really incredible set of pieces that you showed there. I had one question was about being and this robotic form. I'm wondering, had you thought about robotics in your art earlier? Because I know some of the earlier pieces, have almost this idea of almost like a Frankensteinian like robot of pieces that are put together. Some look like parts. I know there's art forms like that, but I'm just curious, were robots at all part of your inspiration and your art at a prior time?
Yeah, I've always been interested in robots, and I've always wanted, actually prior to coming to being, I always had this desire to make a physical robot. But as you know, that's a very expensive endeavor. But I do hope to do it at some point, or at least during my residency, get to apply Being's machine learning model to maybe some other physical robots and see what that feels like. But yeah, I've always been interested in robots, particularly, that sort of eerie relationship that they have to the Black experience. So yeah, I've always been interested.
Thank you. We had always intended to have Rashaad over the robotics lab too. There's so many places we just haven't been able to actually integrate. But actually, I have a quick question which is connected to this. Rashaad, you just mentioned there's an etymological experiential history of robots directly linking from the Czech word of it linking with servitude and reflections of what it means to be human or not, and particularly with the persistent status of Black people as lesser than human. And when I saw the exhibition of To Be Real, which you saw when Being was one earlier iteration of Being was that you saw in the video, and you can see that Being is non-compliant, like it's not answering questions, it's like, initiating exchanges, it's refusing all of the usual conventions associated with obedient robots. Being is a griot, so a site of wisdom, not just listening to orders. And it's also a site of cultural wisdom, which I know you're interested in. It has a different archive, a different training set, if you will. So my question is linked because your work goes right to these questions that's sort of at the heart of human-centered AI, really. It's like, how is the human defined? How is the humanity of us sort of enabled or silenced through interactions with technologies? Who arbitrates people's gender or racial status? And your work offers much more capacious understandings of the body, of movement, of gender, of race, really expanding the repertoires of movement and expression and of natural language archives, really. I mean, we've heard about bias and particularly NLP, and there's some that just say, well, you should include larger vernaculars, but you're going after different kinds of things too. So I wonder if you could just, I think there were questions about what is femme and what is trans. I love that Being is particularly an effort to represent a different kind of embodiment, corporeal reality with social robots, and sort of picking up on James' question of like, how do you put that together with the work that happens with social robots?
Okay, that was
I know that's a big, sorry. This is where Rashaad and I need a cup of coffee.
That was a question, I think.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you wanted why you wanted Being to have these more expressive range.
Okay. Yeah, well, I was thinking a lot about the phrase coined by Legacy Russell, who I believe spoke recently.
Yes.
Yes.
Legacy. Well, explain who Legacy is. Legacy also came to our class on art and AI.
Yeah, she's an assistant curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She's also an artist and a writer who with a huge interest in art and technology. And she's developed what she calls glitch feminism. And I strongly encourage everybody to get her book called Glitch Feminism. If you just Google glitch feminism.
Putting your name also in the chat.
But she coined a phrase called QAVE, which stands for Queer African American Vernacular English. And I feel that, the presence of queerness in intersection with Blackness running alongside the discussion of the non-binary feels urgent. And so I think, possibly Being could offer us a better understanding of the inherent queerness of Blackness, which works against the textures of, misogynoir, queer phobia, that we always find ourselves grappling with. And I think also maybe they can offer us ways to rethink, Black masculinity and femininity, which are also historical binaries that we're always dealing with. And so when creating this model and trying to work with the materials that exist in the world, like in my collage work, that wasn't really possible because when you go through so many of these mocap libraries and things like that, the physical gesticulations of people that have been captured are all white people, you know? And so I'm trying to sort of locate myself also within the conversation of creating this robot. So which is kind of a conundrum, because it's like, I want to be clear, like they're not a Black robot, but they are being created by a Black person. So some of me does show up there. And that's really been challenging, because it really means that I have to build it from the ground up. And so there's a lot of very expensive motion capture going on to get all of those sort of Black vernacular nuances, because I think, we've spoke before about how I believe there's this understanding in CS that robots speak in a neutral way, I believe you said. But I think one has to question, well, who decides what is neutral, you know?
What is that standard English?
Right.
Language, yep.
I think that one person or one group of people deciding what that is an impossibility, you know? Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, Rashaad, we have a couple of questions on Slido that are just kind of more basic for folks who want to understand the talk. So one was, what's your definition for femmes? Because I noticed there's different definitions out there. And then also somebody said, what would you recommend for beginners to this field who want to learn more?
So in terms of femmes are feminine presenting people, which is not tied to gender. It's more of a performance of their gender, or who identify as feminine. And so that's what femmes are. And then how can they get involved in this? Can you be more specific about it?
Well, the question was just, what would you recommend for beginners in the field who want to know more about kind of some of the art forms that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you want to know more about Vogue, I mean, I think there's so much on the internet. You can just Google Vogue. I mean, it really is a performance practice created in Harlem in the Bronx by Black and brown queer people, but it has now become a real global phenomenon. And I mean, there's houses and people all over the world. I mean, I'm working on a performance right now where I'm casting Vogue performers from various continents. And I spoke with someone the other day in Croatia who Vogue. So, I mean, that shows you the reach of the culture. And so, yeah, you can just Google it. There's classes that happen in a lot of big cities.
And Rashaad, I'm thinking also that the question might have been also where, because you have so many fields intersecting, where can people get some traction on these intersections of art, race, and technology? And for that, actually, if that is part of the question, then too, I'm just finished a pilot class on art, activism, and AI, and I have a nicely curated bibliography if people would like it, with links about queer AI and decolonial AI and Black AI and all sorts of things that, you're unique what you're doing, but that because it's interdisciplinary, it can be very challenging for people also to try and enter into these spaces, domains, some of which they feel comfortable with, some of which may seem unusual with. And so I appreciate that question, because I think these are new kinds of intersections too. I know there's other questions too. I have a quick question just listening to the conversation with you and James right now, and that is, when you're talking about trans and non-binary and different kinds of modalities, also racially, one of the things that comes to mind right away is the commitments to categorization and taxonomies of face and identity and facial recognition technology. Everything that some of what your work is doing kind of interrupts that, at a basic core, the kinds of practices of how do you put people, how do you recognize people, all of those things too. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that. It'll be interesting when you're back on campus and in person with how people reconcile the predictive dimensions of a lot of AI, the emphasis on categorization generally and recognition, computer vision recognition, in a world in which you're trying to challenge those standards and conventions.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of facial recognition, that is a part of the model we haven't got to yet, but that's definitely something. So I'll give a bit more. I'm going to screen share again. Bear with me. Okay. Here we go. So yeah, this is sort of like a digital mock-up of basically Being's classroom, which is a exhibition space, a performance space, and a classroom. So this is sort of the exhibition design for the premiere of their first class, which will happen in February. And those classes will be happening February through March at the Park Avenue Armory. But yeah, in terms of, I'm gonna just let it run until we get into the classroom. So this is the front room of the exhibition space, and then we go back here.
I think my students would like this class. They'd want it for credit. I think we should cross-list it with the Stanford offering.
And so this is the performance space, but then also the classroom. And so there will be a series of performances that happen on that stage. And then after those series are done, these classes will happen daily where people can come and actually take the class on the stage. But I wanted to show this because one thing we're trying to figure out now is how Being can look at particular people in the space when they're talking to them. And so we're going to develop that part of the model as we move into the next year. And just thinking about because sort of taking into account all of the data that a lot of great scholars have already done, like Joy and folks like that, to try to really turn that kind of bias of Black and brown people and women on its head. And so more to come on that front.
So another question that's come up on the Slido is, you mentioned near the end about the use of non-Western search and indexing. Can you say a bit more about what that means in practicality for implementing that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to highlight, like queer libraries, Black libraries, just like forms of knowledge that people that are normally not incorporated into a lot of these models. And I really want to center those. And so a big part of what the residency has been thus far is just collecting a lot of that material, which a lot of it is not digitized. It involves speaking with a lot of different institutes and centers, particularly like the Schomburg. And so, yeah, that's sort of what I mean by that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's very striking, I don't know how many people attending today saw the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity keynote with Ruha Benjamin, who was talking about one of the ways to challenge a kind of dominant, say, technological vision and practice is to bring in people who aren't always recognized as the experts. So not just think about Black and brown folks as those who are differentially impacted or who need technologies extended to them, but as co-producers of knowledge. And I think you really worked very hard to do that. I think behind the scenes, I've seen the ways in which you've brought in undergraduates' voices to take them seriously, or graduate students, or people who are in the community, activists. And AI is such a specialized field, and often people feel like they need so much technological expertise even to enter into the conversation, that I think part of what you often are doing, what you were talking about education, is I think that's so interesting, that sort of bi-directional education. It's not a lecture. Clearly it's not a lecture that they're walking into with it, and two. I know that there's some other Slido questions. James, do I have time for another just sort of question?
Yeah, let's just keep going back and forth.
Okay,
Your
now
turn.
especially since you have being up there, which is really great, which was one of the things that Ruha Benjamin mentioned. For those who didn't hear her, she's a Princeton professor in both technology and African American studies, whose work's pretty amazing. But she was talking about the aesthetic principles in a lot of design that is minimalist. And she says reduces, and it's meant a design, the industry word is to become frictionless. But she points out that a lot of that hides complexities and social frictions, including the labor that goes behind the designs, including some of the aesthetic traditions that you're actually sort of bringing back. So I cued you that I was going to ask this question because it's sort of complicated. She's critical of what she calls this sort of seamless minimalist design that now is sort of a preferred aesthetic. And you talk about abstraction as coming from an Africanist context too. Can you put those in relationship? Because I don't see being as creating frictionlessness. I think if you see being or interact, it's like the opposite of a kind of experience of seamlessness or frictionness or ease of use in any way. I don't think being invites ease of use, but I wondered if you could talk about the aesthetics of being in that context.
Yeah, I mean, when I was creating the avatar originally, I had a lot of discussions with a lot of different people. At the time, I was doing my fellowship at LACMA in the Art and Technology Lab. Mm-hmm. Part of that is you get to talk with a lot of different leaders in the field. And I mean, the reality is, like if a robot could visualize themselves, right? I think it's almost hard for us to imagine even what that would look like, And so I don't think that it would look human in any way or, kind of work within a lot of the constructs that we have around what physicality is. Mm-hmm. But which then opens up this like huge scope of like, when you see things like these sort of like abstract sort of light abstractions like you see for agents like Siri and things like that. But I just, the visual artist in me, that was just, I like retinal pleasure, right? And so it was just like, that just wasn't exciting for me to look at. And so I'm looking at them critically, but also from a artistic standpoint. And then when I was, I'm trying to envision this thing that is, attempting to be, post-race, post-gender, which is such an abstract idea because we are not there yet. So abstraction just seemed the best way to go. And then when, you look at abstraction, you can obviously look in the European canon and see tons of great examples, but it was also an opportunity for me to really pay homage to practitioners who really made a way for a lot of those ideas to exist, and so we have to, when we think about abstraction, we have to think about, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Nigeria and all these amazing practitioners of sculpture who really laid the foundation for a lot of the European work that we're often looking at. But then there's also something really kind of that was really kind of excited about with those sculptures, because when you see, also I want to give a shout out to like Richard Scheller, who is he lives on the campus at Stanford, and I visited his home recently, and he has the most incredible collection of African art, and essentially the African art collection at the D Young is basically his collection. But I got a chance to see all this work and that he literally lives with. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking a lot about how those objects, you can put them on a pedestal and you can look at them, but when you see them, they're very shiny and have like oils on them because they were used. And in art, there's a lot of conversations about like activity, like how do you activate the object? And what's exceptional about those objects is that they can be looked at, but they're also they're meant to be used. Mm-hmm. And I feel like trying to apply that narrative to being, I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about the design as well.
in the social rituals. We have really great questions in the chat. I don't know, James, if you want, I'm looking at them, but I don't know if you
Yeah,
want.
I actually wanted to follow up this question because this one hits home for me because I work in human computer interaction and
That's right.
design, and I have to admit I haven't caught Ruha's talk yet. I need to watch it because I've heard about it because of this topic, and I wonder about almost what Rashaad just said. Like, is there a difference between an object that's meant to be seen or experienced a la art versus an object that's meant to be used? And so I could see, oh yeah, we don't want to hide the stories of people in an object like art or film or something you want to communicate story with. On the other hand, and a thing I have to use every day, like there is a reason why design went for simplicity. It really starts with the Bauhaus in the 20s. Like the idea is to really make it easier to use. And so the question is like, do I really want Zoom to have all this other stuff in it that tells stories about, you know, the creators of it and exposes the work, or do I, you know, I got to use it to just get my work done. So there's this trade-off, and I'm wondering, is there a tension there at all when you think about that question? I just think it's a really she asks a really interesting question that's I think there's not a clear answer to.
Yeah, I think it's a personal answer, and for me, yeah, I definitely want to see more of myself in my culture in the technology that I use, because you know, we have to acknowledge. I mean, I think that's why, you know, in, you know, the intro to my project, as you know, Michelle, is like I'm centering this work on, you know, like the name of this institute is Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And what I believe that means is artificial intelligence that highlights the most positive aspects of humanity. But as you know, I've made Bell Hooks sort of like my North Star for this project. Her theories in terms of the capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy, this apparatus can impede on us being able to access those best qualities of humanity. And so if you think you're going to get to any kind of inclusivity or liberatory experience without sort of addressing those issues, you're really kidding yourself. And so there's just so much, we have to acknowledge that the gatekeepers and the leaders of creating this kind of work were not really thinking about a large percentage of the population. And so when you ask like, what do you want to see when you see it? Yeah, I do want to see that because I've been so starved for that.
You know, can I just add something to something that James had said too, because you were talking about you need it, sometimes you need to just have something work. But you know, one of the things that Ruha was saying too is you can forget certain kinds of trade-offs in the efforts. So for instance, the case of Rashaad and I have talked before about, you know, or to use this isn't about technology, but with jazz or whatever, you can forget, for instance, Black cultural contributions to a product that then gets mainstreamed. And so what's lost in the simplicity or the use of, you know, in Rashaad's point is abstraction. If it, you know, Picasso was perfectly happy to import and adapt Africanist aesthetics, and some of that eventually gets sort of dropped and left behind. So something could there's risks involved with naturalizing and normalizing. I just want to use it for this end, if in fact it requires a kind of amnesia or forgetting of contributions that led up to it as well. And that happens in history, of course, too, when you're thinking about women's contributions and others as well. So that's a hard thing. It's hard because now we've internalized, I just need it to do something.
I would say science too, right? Everything builds on everything else, but
yeah, right, exactly.
They often forget, you know, where it came from and
right. It's looking, yes, and it's a willed forgetfulness, and sometimes that's necessary, and other times it's occluding or eliding really important history. So I love that question, James. I see some practical questions in the slide. Go ahead and ask.
So I was going to say, you know, Rashaad's definition of human-centered AI is really interesting because it opens up, you know, that term is so ambiguous in the first place, so it opens up everyone else to have their own interpretation, which I think is really actually empowering about the name. So some of the questions in here, here's one pretty straightforward. Someone said, do you know of any examples of similar cultures that have emerged in other parts of the world? And, you know, I don't know if that's referring to the voguing kind of culture or what, but maybe you want to take that one.
Yeah, I need some more specificity on that. Like, what kind of cultures? Do I know of any other cultures that have developed in the world? I mean, what does that even mean? That's a question.
I think they were referring to the voguing type of culture that you were using, saying so similar to that in other places.
Yeah, I mean, well, as I said before, voguing as a performance practice has now become globalized. And to kind of go back to what you were just saying about how, you know, culture, you know, how through this minimalist, you know, approach, how things get kind of erased. I mean, I think voguing is really on the precipice of that, because now you have this Black and queer culture that was born out of resistance for Black and brown queer people in the US, particularly in Harlem and the Bronx, to create safe space for themselves. There's a performance practice that becomes a way for people to actually sustain themselves even. And so there's all this sort of resistance history tied to this dance. But now as it becomes this global phenomenon, all of that is kind of thrown away and it's just a dance. And so how do we share that culture without kind of throwing out all of the history that's tied to it? And I think it's something that I really struggle with, because I think the nature of diasporic dance beyond Vogue is that it's like about the collective, right? It's not about valorizing this like one person. And I think that's also something that you see within the sculptural practices, like when you, that I'm referencing in the model, you know, when you think about the female faux mask that inspired the face, you know, when you read about that, it's like of the Chokwe people of the Congo. There's not like one person. And so there's this sort of assembly of people that bring forth these ideas. And it's about, I always just kind of liken it to code. I think that everybody is a programmer, like contributing to this like Black code, and it keeps growing and morphing. And so I'm kind of getting off topic, but to go back to Vogue is it's a struggle, because it's like you want to share the culture, but we're not in an equitable society. And so how does, you know, typical diasporic traditions work within a capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy?
All hyphenated too.
I really put that as a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like that question. I want to connect it to one that I see in Slido too, which is you're talking about how do you not just turn Vogue in this particular case into something that's just an aesthetic thing to watch. There's a kind of voyeurism of that, you know, you want to but there's also questions about technical things, which is, I know you're interested in creating motion capture of, and so one of the questions was, how have you run into any technical difficulties with capturing the more nuanced kinds of movements? I think there's a lot of interest in, like, how do you just do this technologically, especially if the technology is not necessarily created for it. And Katie Kwan, also a PhD CS student, is also sort of interested in this kind of question too. Have you run into technical difficulties? I think that's the question, paraphrasing.
Yeah, with getting the data, I guess the first technical difficulty is that it just doesn't exist. So you have to create it. And the tools are there to create it. That's not the problem, but it can be quite costly. You know, because motion capture is a very expensive thing to do. And there's various ways, it's kind of opening up, there's various ways to do it. I'm very excited to explore some of the modalities people have developed on campus once things open up. But particularly like when you get into like the fingers and things like that, and as we're working on the CG for the next avatar, you know, I want the face to move, but not in this, you know, cartoonish way. And so there's just, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, again, QA, Black, queer, vernacular expression, and how so much of that is through facial expressions, not through words or sounds. And so you really have to get mocap of people from the community, and the most expensive versions of mocap, which are like hands, fingers, and face. You know, the body is a bit more, you know, cost effective.
So related to that question is a question earlier about, you were talking about the use of non-Western search and indexing. Could you talk about that, what that means in implementation? And I was thinking about that because I know, Rashaad, you've been really interested in creating a kind of archive of this as well. And it's also global and not just non-Western. Where does that live right now? Or how you had issues with kind of indexing and making available this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in the very early stages of that because, again, just we're kind of building this from the ground up, right? And so the information that the model will access has to first be culled together. And so that's a huge task in itself. And then once figuring out a way of how the model will navigate that is something we're still in process of. So yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I'm thinking about in relationship to that is just how to use a language that is more accessible to people. Because one thing that I'm really thinking a lot about are just kind of like people who exist outside of academia, and how sometimes the jargon and the language we can use can can be a little bit distancing for someone not coming from that space. And the goal for me is to try to decolonize, or not decolonize, that's overdetermined, but get many people to start a decolonizing process. And you can't do that from distance, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about how can I bring in, how can I train the model on certain language so that it can express these kind of very broad ideas, but in a very accessible way.
I know someone's going to put in the chat, what is decolonizing, but we'll return to that in a minute, hopefully. And I have, that's on my bibliography too, so that will help people do a kind of cheat sheet of what some of these, speaking of jargon, I'm sure that some people have questions. James, I see you unmuted, so.
Yeah. So we had another question. Someone said maybe it's a trivial question, but I don't think it's trivial. It says, as statistics have been used to condemn Blackness, what do you think about AI tools which rely on statistical methods?
Can you use the master's tools to dismantle the house, as Audre Lorde would put it?
Yes, I think that I don't see computer science and machine learning and all of that as the master's tools. It's a tool that that a certain group of people had more access than others, right, for a long period of time. But I think things are changing, and I think as more and more people start to engage with these tools, that they will take different shapes. Like as I sit here in West Oakland, right, I can't help but think about, so I'm going to talk just a little bit. It's not a formal part of my residency, but I'm also working on an intermediary between 1.0 and 2.0, which is an app version of this AI that will sort of act as a life coach, therapist, and connector. And so it's sort of like a virtual therapy app that's sort of building on models like, what is it?
Like a robot?
Eliza, yeah. So it's a, virtual therapist that can sort of be a space for you to get out emotions you're feeling around daily racial indignities, but also it can give you daily affirmations and give you different strategies on how to calm yourself so you can continue to fight the good fight. And so that's in very early stages and requires a lot of work with therapists who specialize in PTSD. But anyway, I'm saying that to say, as I sit here working on that particular project in West Oakland, the birthplace of like the Black Panther Party, I'm like, if I'm looking at computer science and ML as like the master's tools, I have no doubt if the Black Panthers survive, they would be all in ML and CS. This app that I'm trying to create to help Black people navigate systemic racism would be fully supported. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like everybody has a phone, so if you want to connect to folk, you know, and you like technology is undoubtedly the way to do it, you know? So like I can't access those types of tools to get that kind of really important reach if I'm looking at it as the master's tools, you know?
You know, that was a question that came up, a version of that in my class a lot with the undergraduates similarly too, which was a deeper recognition of the harms that can be caused in social science practices, in this case of statistics and everything, and really navigating how, when, and where do you reject a whole methodology, or do you, how and when can you embrace it? And I think Ruha mentioned something that connects up, I believe, with sort of what you were saying too, which is not just thinking about these questions and ethics checks and so on in the design of something, but even in the research questions before, like to what ends are you using statistics? So asking questions, you know, why was a product created in the first place as well? And so I think that's really interesting. It would have been very interesting if the Black Panthers were still around to use it, because I think of all the questions around surveillance and privacy would of course been a top of mind as well, but doesn't necessarily mean it would have been interesting if, for those of you who weren't familiar with Rashaad's, the app that he's creating, because I was going to ask you also about therapeutics in the classroom, is it's meant to be an app particularly for peoples of color, with a recognition. We were talking about Victor Carrion, who's a Stanford professor and the School of Medicine psychiatrist, and wonderful, and works with generational trauma with children of color. So the PTSD you're talking about, especially in the wake of not just the pandemic, but of course all the social unrest that's happening, is also a sort of interesting intervention, because it's a very distinct use of technologies that's recognizing people's distinctive experiences.
I just put the link to the
thank you
about the app in the chat.
Yeah, we have a couple more minutes. James, do you want to bring in anybody else's questions? I want to make sure that people who are
Yeah, I mean, I thought one was interesting, was someone, I'll just give you a couple at once. One was about, hey, what artists inspire you? And then another was more technical. They were wondering whether you used a technique, I think, from choreography, Laban movement analysis, as a way to decode or code the movement in relation to the folk sequences.
Mm-hmm. Also, before I answer those, I want to go back to the previous question that I don't think it's so binary either, that like, you know, the way it was set up. I think that you can also you can discover different technologies and tools, and you can reimagine them in the way that gives you optimal well-being, right? That's what the other folks are doing. So everybody has to do that, you know? So I just wanted to put that out there. But anyway, artists that inspire me, so many. Who inspires me? Oh, Arthur Jaffa. I really love
your mentor. He's your mentor. There was a big piece on him in the New York Times last week.
Yeah, he's great. Theaster Gates. I prefer to call Deacon Theaster Gates, because I mean his work is really a ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Who else?
It's one of those questions where if you forget somebody, that you can hear about them on social media.
Like those are two, you know, like there's a ton of people, but I can think of them.
Yeah. Well, luckily, Rashaad, you're going to be here next year, and I really want to invite. Thank you for all of these really great questions.
Oh, wait, I want to say this. I want to say this because I'm not just inspired by artists. You know, I'm inspired by like writers. For me, I think writers are even more inspiring than artists in some way, because you know, when I read something like that you wrote, or like Ruha, or any other, when I read those things, I'm reading them, but I'm thinking about how can I visualize this? You know what I mean? And that's even more inspiring than sometimes than looking at other work, you know? Yeah,
thank you. You can, I hope people can get a sense of like what a great interlocutor and like conversant Rashaad is. And I'm so grateful that you're going to be here next year, because I know that people will want to. You're such a great person to come and interact with people, and we can learn from you, and I know you have been learning from the Stanford communities as well. And I want to leave James with the last word. I brought James into, I really wanted to make sure that we had the arts, humanities people, and also the STEM folks too. And James always asks such wonderful questions. So I appreciate everybody showing up in conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm excited actually that you're coming back for more time, because I think this has been unfortunate not to interact with you. And I know we're running out of time, but the last thing I think is really interesting to me is you like the rest of us had to suffer, under, work from home, which, hey, it's not so bad if you're not sick and other horrible things like losing your job that a lot of people have befallen, but it's not great. And I'm curious of doing this whole residency remote like this. Did it lead to new creativity, new thoughts on, because you're doing all this stuff about technology, like, did it change your thinking by having to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. It really made me think a lot about like live streaming and the imaginative possibilities of really fully leaning into that modality of communicating, but also expressing oneself. And I don't think that a lot of people have even cracked the surface of what's possible with virtual reality, and I'm really looking forward to just jumping out the window with that as we kind of open up and kind
Okay,
of
not jumping out the window.
well, that's just like a term, jumping out the window and just like just really fully embracing, what I mean? About I feel like what folks have done is the quick response to that is like, well, let's recreate IRL experiences. So let's get on Zoom and let's talk. But like, we could all be avatars. We could be in different environments. There's so much possibility that hasn't even been touched. So I'm really excited to explore that.
Thank you so much for that question, James. That was so awesome. And thank you everybody for the questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but we have those for Rashaad for later also. So clearly the conversation will continue. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And we look forward to continuing these high seminars also in the future as well.